So I'm going to be talking about essentially our achievements, learnings, challenges and opportunities for the future. I put this presentation together last week, and when I put it all together, it was probably going to be about an hour long, and I thought, well, okay, I'm going to have to cut it back, or I'm going to have to speak very quickly, so I'm going to try and do a bit of both. And so the compacted version of what I'm going to try and do is talk about why the scheme in New South Wales looks the way it does, how that design is helping us to deliver what we consider to be a world-class scheme, and then I'll talk about sort of the achievements and challenges, et cetera, et cetera. Along the way, I hope either myself or some of my colleagues or the partners in the program will dispel some common myths that we know are out there. So, and curious if you have questions if they come up. So, without further ado, I always try and remind people of this. The New South Wales scheme, it is a litter initiative. That is the primary objective of it, is to reduce the volume of litter in New South Wales. It does have a secondary objective, which is to recycling, but that's primarily about saying, okay, if we're going to collect all this material, we want to make sure that it's recycled. That's secondary objective. And these things have then gotten picked up into the Premier's priority to reduce the volume of litter by 40% by 2020, which we are well on the way to achieving. But more about that later. So the basic premise, for those of you who are not familiar with container deposit schemes, but essentially it's about saying that if you put an incentive on containers, 10 cents, and you make the returning them really convenient, and you give people a good customer experience, then they're going to come back, and that means you give people that incentive to hold on to the containers when they buy them and consume them, and it also creates that incentive for people who find containers littered on the ground to pick them up and bring them in for the 10 cents. So that's the premise: convenience, good customer experience, and the incentive. There's a few other things which we had constraints on our design, and this is going to be different than the Queensland and ACT schemes, which will be presented as well. In New South Wales, some of these will probably be similar, but certainly we had to have a scheme that was going to be delivered statewide. It had to be accessible in remote and regional areas as well as in metro. It had to have an incentive, obviously, that's the 10 cents. It had to complement the curbside system. It was not about trying to cannibalize that system, it was about trying to complement it. It had to be cost efficient, which is, this is can be somewhat of an issue. You can do a Rolls-Royce scheme, which is going to be very expensive, or you can do super cheap, but not actually deliver your outcome. So we had to find that middle ground. And then lastly, this is a producer responsibility initiative, so it was to be done at zero cost, or no cost to government. It all had to be financed through the beverage industry. So what did we end up with? We ended up with a scheme which is, that's a funny looking picture, didn't quite come out as planned. Well, essentially what we've done is we've split the responsibilities for running the scheme between a scheme coordinator and a network operator. And we do get questions about why we've done that, because certainly in other jurisdictions they have not gone down this path. But essentially what we wanted to do is we looked at how other schemes worked around the world, and we looked at, in South Australia, for example, where they've been running it for 40 years. And one of the, some of the things, the learnings that we had in that sort of design phase was about saying, okay, when there are asymmetries in the relationship between the person running it and the people delivering it on the ground, the collection points, you get problems, and that's what we saw in South Australia. Was there was a lot of disputes happening. We didn't want to have that happen, so we wanted to have some sort of balance of interests. And the other thing is there are clearly different interests at play, and we wanted to also ensure that what the structure aligned with those incentives. So what we've ended up with is we've got a scheme coordinator, Exchange for Change. Their shareholders are the beverage industry. And then you look at, okay, what are their incentives? Their incentives are Clearly, they want to make sure the scheme is run at the lowest cost as possible, but they also want to make sure that all the other beverage suppliers are in the scheme, you know, because if they're not in the scheme, then the ones who are in are the ones are paying for them. So they've got a really strong incentive to go out there, chase down the free riders, and get them into the scheme, which is great because that aligns entirely with what our interests are: low cost, minimizing things like fraud, etc., and making sure there are no free riders. At the network operator level, again, we wanted to align the incentives. So essentially the network operator gets paid on a per container basis. Their incentive is to go out and get as many containers as possible, and they're responsible for rolling out the network of collection points. So it's about saying, you know, we had a minimum number that we wanted to see across the state. Their incentive is actually to go beyond that. Their incentive is to go out and make it as convenient as possible to try and capture as many containers as possible. And again, I think we've done that. The other thing, before I move on from this slide, and I'm probably going to spend way too much time here, is just to say how we got to this point was through a competitive tender process, where we went out to the market and it was a reverse tender. We said, you know, ask the market, you tell us how to do this, and you tell us how much it will cost. And so through that process, we've ended up with, a single scheme coordinator and a single network operator. What the single network operator, because we did, you know, there was a possibility we get up with multiple network operators. We ended up with one. The advantages of that are that we have essentially we can have a single customer experience across the entire state, and it also gives them the ability now to invest and sort of de-risk that investment of infrastructure. And there's a big investment. That's the one takeaway from this you can take away is that there's a lot of investment goes into setting up collection points and the logistics to back that up, et cetera. So, and what we were looking for is putting in infrastructure into areas that traditionally have been very hard to access. I mean, we run things like chemical cleanouts and community recycling centers, and we know how hard it is to set that stuff up. So what we've ended up with is a system that actually incentivizes people to do that work. And we're very pleased to see that the outcome of that is that we've got various zones around the state, and in almost every single one of them, we've gotten far more collection points than the minimum required. So we feel good that the system is working. It is delivering what we wanted it to do, and it's being done in a way that is delivering a community, optimized for the community as opposed to optimized necessarily for the company doing it. That was the tender. Was we chose somebody who was going to deliver something that we thought was going to work. Other achievements. Number one, as I said, this is primarily a litter reduction initiative, and we've just got the latest results from Keep Australia Beautiful, who do surveys. They do the National Litter Index, and we get them to also check along the in between. And the latest results is we've reduced the volume of litter by 57% of container litter. Sorry. So again, that's we're very happy with that outcome. You're talking about a little over a year, and we're already 57% reduction. When we started this, beverage containers were the number one. They're about 49% of the volume of litter. They were twice as much as the next category, which was takeaway food containers. They're no longer the number one category. They've now they're the number two category now. So really good outcome in that regard. 101.8 billion containers collected. That's continuing to increase. More than 30 million containers a week being collected. Access to the system, so it's not only about putting collection points out, it's about those things, they've got to be open and operating, and so we do measure that, and we've got 96% uptime, we refer to it as, for the reverse vending machines. 878 million containers still coming through curbside and being redeemed, so we're supporting, complementing the curbside system. That's actually the latest quarter is just being paid out right now, so we're actually heading more towards 1 billion containers through the curbside system. And what we've seen is good take up by the community sector. That $350,000 only relates to, if you go to a reverse vending machine, you can choose a charity the money to go to. That doesn't include all the community groups that are out there collecting containers and bringing to the collection points on their own. So, from that, I'm going to drill down a little bit. I'm hoping somebody's tracking the time because, so in terms of then how are we doing in terms of the collection, that top line up there, that's the supply. That's the number of containers coming into the market. As you can see, it changes significantly through the year. 3.5 billion containers, big peaks around December, New Year's time. You know, so there's a 40% difference between summer and winter, essentially. And what we see down the bottom here is this upward line, that's collecting through collection network, through the collection points. That has just been going up steadily. And then the other line there is refunds through kerbside. So it has gone down, but but the overall amount is far exceeded what kerbside was collecting before. In terms of redemption rates, as in, you know, how are we tracking against supply? It's sort of been tracking in the first year. We've kind of gone between the 50 and 60% mark. But since December, we know we had that big spike of supply. And so we were expecting the return rate to also go up in January. So December goes up, a month later redemptions go up. But what we're really pleased to see is that it's actually continued. Even though supply dropped off, the return rate has, the amount of containers coming back to the system didn't actually drop as much. So what we think is people actually came and tried it, they liked it, and they've continued to use it. I want to touch briefly on kerbside. So we did look at what's the impact on kerbside bin. Because that's one of the myths we get is, oh, you know, all we did is we've created a system, we've taken the stuff out of the yellow bin and taken it to a new collection point. What's the point? Just add a lot of cost. So what we did was we had a look at this and we said, okay, we won't look at the very beginning, but we'll look at, you know, the sort of June to November period in the first year, so the second half of the first year, compared to the same period a year earlier before the scheme was introduced. And what we found is that after, you know, a year later, the amount of materials going through kerbside has reduced by around 9%. There's significant reduction when you look at individual materials. So aluminium has dropped by about 47%, glass down by about 25%, plastics down by about 15%. But the reason it's only 9% overall is because there's a lot of other materials, cardboard, paper, etc., in the bin. So yes, there has been a shift of materials from kerbside into the collection system. But then when we looked at, okay, well, what does that mean in terms of what are we actually collecting? What we found is that we've still collected 40% more than what we were getting before through that kerbside system. So, you know, we are actually mining that litter stream and the red bins, and which is why the litter amounts are going down. So it makes sense. Lessons learned. So this is a real quick snapshot. There's a lot more I could be saying in this space, but so I'll start with the negatives, the things we learned that we wish we knew before. First one is deploying infrastructure takes time. Through whatever reasons, by the time the government decided they actually wanted to do this, we immediately got the act through. We went out to tender. There was a change of minister. We had to re-tender. Blah 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 blah. We ended up with only 4 months to deploy, you know, hundreds of collection points, and that was just, you know, that was never going to happen. But what it meant was, of course, is that people suddenly started paying more for their drinks, and they just didn't have anywhere to take it. There was a lot of feedback, negative feedback at the beginning of the scheme, and you know, that's if anybody here from WA or Victoria or anybody, the lesson is 4 months is definitely not enough. If you think you've got enough time, you need more time. Second one, this one relates to beverage suppliers. Because of the, again, this is entirely related to the 4 months, they needed 3 months notice to be able to increase prices, to be able to pay for the scheme. We only had 4 months, so we really only had 30 days to get the message to them of how much it was going to cost them and how it was all going to work. And that created mayhem. And it also didn't give us the time to actually work that through with the beverage industry and make sure that those systems were going to work properly. And what we've ended up with is, while we thought we were giving them something that was very equitable and very fair and would push the money back to them if things weren't collected, because they only pay for what's collected, we thought we were doing something good. It actually created a lot of headaches and a lot of administrative burden onto them. And so that's something we're working on now to fix that. And then the last thing was, there were other things outside of the scheme, namely China Sword, which caused then issues around the refund sharing agreements. So if any of you are from councils, you will know about refund sharing agreements and all of the complexities around that. It was always going to be challenging, but the fact that China Sword came in and then it became a negotiation not only about sharing refunds, but about redoing gate fees because material values have changed, just made it really, really messy. So again, if we'd known that was going to happen, we probably would have done it differently. In terms of the positives, the bit I started with around the aligning of the structure with the incentives, I think that we feel has been really valuable. We have not had to come in with the heavy hand of regulation. The scheme is very much moving in the direction we want. We're working with those partners to achieve that, but we're happy that it's more like we're on the same road together. Okay, don't assume that is another takeaway though, which is that even though we're on all the road together, don't assume that it's all that's going to happen. We have had to invest a lot of time and energy into those relationships because it's a contract. It's a contract, and with any contract, it's only as good as the time you put into it. And so, that was a key learning, and we're happy that we've invested that time in it. Last thing about RVMs, again, this is something which is unique in New South Wales. We've ended up with a lot of RVMs. We're very happy with them. They're incredibly popular. About 80% of containers collected in New South Wales go through an RVM. The advantages of them are, they have a very small footprint and they do very high volumes. And so, in terms of that, getting infrastructure on the ground in urban built-up areas, it's worked pretty well. They've been co-located with retail spaces like shopping centers and supermarkets, etc. So people are already going there, so it makes it just that convenience even better. And then the big takeaway from this is that it gives us a huge amount of data, and the data from coming out of this the scheme. That's when I said at the beginning about modern world-class system. It's that part of it. We get real-time data. We know when a machine goes down. We're able to actually feed that back to the community and say, okay, you can go on the website and you can see how is that machine, is it worth my time to go down there? And you can see, okay, that machine's almost full, or that machine is full, don't go there. This one over here is in operation, it's still working, everything good. So it's that immediate feedback loop has been really valuable. Okay, so challenge ahead. Fixing the small supplier stuff. We know the beverage industry is not entirely happy with our scheme, but we'll deal with that. And obviously the China Sword issues and glass, etc. Opportunities for the future. Obviously there's harmonization. We've now got schemes in various states. There's a lot of similarities, things like 10 cents, who's in, what beverages are covered, etc. That's similar, but there's also differences, and so there's opportunities there to do some harmonization. There's Opportunities to optimize the network. Again, this goes back to that 4-month rollout, is that, you know, there was this mad rush to get infrastructure on the ground. Some places are very, very popular, other places are not, you know, not getting utilized. So we're looking at, well, how do we now realign some of those things so it's a more even system. It's about reaching out into some of the regional areas that may not have the infrastructure they need, and realigning stuff in Sydney metro area, et cetera. And then the last thing, again, is about just that fixing things up for suppliers, reducing that burden on them. That's it from me. Any questions?